Anyway, I'll start this way. As you all know, Stalin died in March of 1953, but it was a particular moment, of course, in Soviet history and world history. Dwight Eisenhower had been elected president in November of 1952, the first Republican president in 20 years. And he ran on a platform not of containing communism, which had governed US policy under Truman, as outlined by George Kennan, the famous diplomat. But Eisenhower and his principal advisor, John Foster Dulles, ran on a platform of rolling back communism. So it was going to be supposed to be a more aggressive policy. When Eisenhower was elected, and even before his inauguration in January, Churchill, who was again prime minister, advised Eisenhower, urged him to meet with Stalin to try to help with the Cold War atmosphere at that time. Keep in mind, there was an active war in Korea. Europe was divided. Churchill had already given his Iron Curtain speech 6 years earlier, but Eisenhower was resistant to the idea of meeting with Stalin. After the inauguration on January 20th, of course, Churchill renewed that appeal. But again, Eisenhower resisted the idea. He was very nervous. He thought the Soviets would get the better of any American negotiators. He was very influenced by what they thought happened at Yalta. So he didn't really want to have a summit. And then out of nowhere, Stalin collapsed from a stroke on Sunday, March 1st. So let's go to the first slide. And of course, he died on March 5th. Now, here in 1947, Stalin is sitting with some of his closest members of the Politburo. You see Stalin in the middle. To our left, in the second row, you see Lavrenti Beria, the famous security chief with the pince-nez, and then Lazar Kaganovich with the mustache. Kaganovich was the only Jew remaining at that level of power in the Soviet leadership. He was very close to Stalin. In the 1930s, when Stalin would leave Moscow, Kaganovich would take over day-to-day responsibilities in the Kremlin. Then you have Vyacheslav Molotov, the famous foreign minister. His wife, Polina Zhemchuzhina, was Jewish. She had a brother living in Bridgeport. 2 years later, his wife, Polina Zhemchuzhina, was arrested because she had been a little too friendly with Golda Meir in the fall of 1948 at a reception in Moscow. Between Kaganovich and Molotov in the second row is Georgy Malenkov, reputed to be the number 2 man in the leadership. And then between Molotov and Stalin, you see Kuznetsov, Alexei Kuznetsov, who was the party leader in Leningrad, and then to our right of Kuznetsov in the second row is Nikolai Voznесensky. Now I highlight the presence of those two guys because in 1949, they were arrested and executed. So these guys were not simply Stalin's closest collaborators and accomplices. They were always his potential victims, and they understood that. And until the day Stalin collapsed on March 1st, they lived in great fear of him. Let's go to the next slide. Now here we're in 1952 on the stage of the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. There's a larger group of the leadership, Stalin, of course, in the middle, and your position in relation to Stalin is highly choreographed. The closer you are to Stalin, the higher you are in the hierarchy of authority and prestige. So next to Stalin is Molotov, to our left is Malenkov, and to the right is Molotov. And then far to our left, the farthest figure from Stalin on our left is a little figure, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. This is January 52. Khrushchev is there. He's among the leaders, but he's the farthest away from Stalin. A year later, when Stalin grew sick, Eisenhower had no idea who Khrushchev was. He refers to him as the little-known Khrushchev. Next slide. Now, this is October 1952, Stalin's last public speech, his last public appearance is at the 19th Party Congress in Moscow. Leaders from all over the world came to Moscow, leaders of the communist movement. Stalin had always given the major address at these congresses beginning in the 1920s, and he would speak for 4 or 5 hours. He only spoke for about 10 minutes when he closed the conference that October. Khrushchev later noted in his memoirs that Stalin seemed to slur his words, and he thought that Stalin was already a sick man and perhaps had suffered strokes. But this was not something Khrushchev could ever have said out loud at the time. Malenkov actually gave the major address of 4 to 5 hours at the Congress, but Stalin sat silently on the stage while Molotov spoke. He obviously was not physically capable of standing at the podium and speaking for that long. Next slide. This image of Stalin was taken during the Congress, but it could not appear in the Soviet press because he looks a little older, not so alert, perhaps half awake. An image like this could never appear in the Soviet press. Next slide. Now, one of the famous events of the last months of Stalin's life was the doctor's plot. On January 13th, 1953, the Soviet press announced that a plot had been exposed involving Jewish doctors, Western imperialists, and Zionists. They didn't say Israel, they said Zionists, who were plotting to undermine the health of Soviet leaders using their medical expertise. And this set off a tsunami of propaganda against Jewish doctors and Zionists and American imperialism in the Soviet press. This image appeared in the Soviet magazine Krokodil, which was the satirical journal in Moscow. You see a medical doctor who wears a benevolent mask of a sympathetic, intelligent professor looking. But underneath the mask, you see the image of a Jewish predator with claws covered in blood instead of fingers, gold coins falling from his pocket. And underneath, you can't read the caption, it says, you know, the traces of a crime. So this was the kind of image that pervaded the Soviet press in the last months of Stalin's life in connection with the doctor's plot. This led to great fears in the Jewish community, even the idea that Stalin was going to deport, to exile Jews from the major European cities, Moscow, Leningrad, Riga, where hundreds of thousands of Jews were living, to somewhere in the East, Central Asia, Siberia, the artificial Jewish district Birobidzhan. And even to this day, many Jews from that generation and after believe that that was Stalin's plan. In fact, there's some dispute over this, but no single document has been found in Soviet archives that really documents that this was his exact plan. So no one can say for sure how Stalin intended to culminate the doctor's plot. Next slide. Now, Stalin collapsed on Sunday, March 1st from a terrible stroke. It was actually the Jewish holiday of Purim, which celebrates the saving of the Jews from the evil plans of Haman and the Persian Empire to go after them. What happened was he had hosted his small group of Politburo members the night before at the Kremlin. They'd watched the movie. Then at midnight, as typical for Stalin, he invited them for dinner at the dacha, 8 or 10 miles outside of Moscow. They stayed till 4 or 5 in the morning and then left. Khrushchev said Stalin was in a good mood, but drank too much. The next day, Stalin would typically rise at 11 a.m. He was a late sleeper. He was a nocturnal person. And then he would ring a bell and the guards would bring him tea or breakfast. The rule was that no one could enter Stalin's private living quarters without being summoned. He had paranoid fear of assassination, so the guards wouldn't ring a bell, wouldn't go through the door. But they never heard from Stalin. The afternoon wore on, the evening wore on, And then at 10 at night, they decided to send in an old woman who was a housekeeper, but who Stalin knew for many years, figuring if he was okay and he saw her, he wouldn't get alarmed. She found him on the floor, lying in his own urine and barely able to speak or move. She summoned the guards. They lifted him onto a sofa and then began calling the leaders. They came around 2 in the morning, Beria and Khrushchev, and then they left. Stalin was asleep. And they said, look, you've alarmed us for no reason. He's just sleeping. So we're going home. So the guards knew something was wrong, and they began calling again in the morning. And only then were doctors summoned, who immediately understood that Stalin had suffered a severe stroke, and there was very little they could do. He died on Thursday night, March 5th. The next day in Pravda, you see the announcement of his death, with a medical bulletin signed by 11 or 12 doctors, none of whom could be Jewish, because they had to assure the country that Stalin had died a natural death, that he'd been treated with the best medical care available under the close supervision of the Central Committee, and that no Jewish doctors were involved. There was nothing to worry about in terms of his illness, his collapse, or his death. They had not announced his illness until March 4th, the day before he died, because they wanted to make sure he would in fact die. And secondly, they were maneuvering for power among themselves and dividing up the functions of power among themselves. And so until that was settled, they kept insisting the doctors do everything they could to keep Stalin alive, although he was in a coma. Next slide. Now, this is my favorite picture my editors found from March 6th, the next day in Washington. This is obviously a Jewish deli in Washington, advertising free borscht to celebrate the death of Stalin. Next image. Here we have Stalin in the Hall of Columns in the House of Unions in Moscow. You'll notice all the flowers. You'd expect that. In fact, all cut flowers in the country were requisitioned to be brought to Moscow to honor Stalin. The same night Stalin died, the famous composer Sergei Prokofiev also died of a stroke. And there were no flowers available at his funeral a day or two later. And in fact, there is no mention in the Soviet press of his death for several days. Keep in mind that when John F. Kennedy was killed in November 1963, on the same day, the famous British author Aldous Huxley died. And there was hardly any notice of Huxley's death for several days because there was so much attention to the shocking events out of Dallas. Next image. Thousands and thousands of people, perhaps millions, poured through the streets of Moscow toward the center of Moscow to walk through the House of Columns, the Hall of Columns, to view Stalin's body. Khrushchev later admitted that the police had lost control of the crowds, and perhaps over 100 people were trampled to death. There were also casualties in Leningrad and Tbilisi. But it wasn't because of any beatings or shootings. It was simply because the crowds could not be controlled by the militia. Next image. Here we are just a block away from the House of Unions in front of the Bolshoi Theater. Keep in mind, it's winter. People are heavily dressed. You see snow on the ground. This is what the crowds look like. Next image. This is Stalin's son, Vasily, who was a complete drunk. He was an officer in the Air Force. He was arrested later that year, sent to a labor camp for corruption, and died within a decade from cirrhosis of the liver. Next image. And this is the leaders taking Stalin's coffin from the House of Unions. You see Beria on the right, Malenkov on the left, and then they would walk through the streets of Moscow to Red Square where the funeral ceremony was held. This is 3 days later on March 9th. Go ahead. Now, the same day the funeral was held, large crowds gathered in the capitals of Eastern Europe. Here we are, 100,000 people in Prague, They were obviously taken there officially by bus to honor Stalin. A similar crowd gathered in Berlin, in Bucharest, in Budapest, and in Tirana, Albania. Over 1 million people were gathered in downtown Tirana, made to stand on their knees and for 2 hours recite a pledge of allegiance to Stalin. Next image. Now, the next day in Pravda, this image appeared. You see Stalin, Mao, and Malenkov with his hand in his shirt, as if he's Napoleon-like in a commanding image, just like Stalin. He's now the equal of Stalin. But this was not the real photograph. Let's look at the next image. This is the real photograph from 1950 when Chinese and Soviet leaders signed a friendship pact. And you can see Malenkov on the right, and Stalin and Mao in the middle. Only Vyshinsky is sitting down. He's now the foreign minister signing the document. Everyone remembered this original photograph and understood that Malenkov was trying to artificially elevate himself above the others. Let's go back to the photograph before that. Can we go backwards one image?
Apologies. It's proving to be difficult to go backwards. Give me
No
just
problem. The only issue here is the others were furious with Malenkov for this maneuver. It was like Stalin to relegate his enemies whom he'd killed to the Orwellian memory hole. But this was supposed to be a collective leadership. So they were angry with Malenkov and demoted him a rung or two within the leadership for doing this. Next image. Any luck?
it's looking like it's the last one. Is there?
Okay. Well, let me just end with one more brief statement. We had an image of Eisenhower giving a speech on April 16th, the Chance for Peace. Eisenhower gave two very famous speeches during his 8 years in office. On April 16th in Washington, Eisenhower extended a hand to Soviet leaders with his speech, The Chance for Peace, where he spoke about how wasteful it was to spend so much money on armaments, when instead we could use that money for agricultural development, to build hospitals, to build schools. And he made a similar speech at the end of his term in office, just before leaving, where he warned about the military-industrial complex. After Eisenhower's speech, a week later, the Soviet leaders published Eisenhower's speech in full, without any cuts, even where Eisenhower blamed Stalin for the division of Europe and the tensions in Europe. And this, I believe, was an obvious signal they were willing to negotiate with Eisenhower. But Eisenhower refused to take up that challenge. So I closed the book by suggesting that there was a chance for greater negotiation to reduce tensions in the Cold War at that moment, and that was a missed opportunity. But keep in mind that in July, there was the outbreak of riots in East Germany, and those were put down by Soviet troops. So it would have been very hard for American leaders to sit down with Soviet leaders at that moment. Now I'd like to introduce Jonathan Brent, our classmate. Jonathan and I studied Russian together at Columbia, so it's lovely. Who knew where it would take us, Jonathan? But here we are, and Jonathan has also written widely on this subject. So we'll hear from Jonathan now. Thank you. Jonathan, you're muted.
Of that. Oh, okay. All right. Thank you, Josh. It's a pleasure to take part in this. I wasn't terribly sociable when I was at Columbia, so many of you, it seems as though we're meeting for the first time, though I'm sure we had classes together. Anyhow, I had the good fortune of working in the Soviet archives in the 1990s. And for Yale University Press, and where I founded the Annals of Communism project. And part of that experience included my work with Vladimir Pavlovich Naumov, who had been a historian during the Gorbachev period. He was very close to Alexander Nikolaevich Yakovlev. He was a Gorbachev Democrat. He hated Stalin viscerally. I believed he was Jewish. He used to tell me Jewish jokes and pretend that they were Russian jokes. He knew Yiddish, but he refused to accept the fact that he was Jewish. But he devoted the last 10 or 15 years of his life to studying the liquidation of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, to working on the rehabilitation of those individuals, and then on the doctor's plot, which included the last days of Stalin and Stalin's death. When I asked him whether we were going to get to the bottom of the KGB on the doctor's plot, he said, absolutely, we'll get to the bottom of the KGB, but the KGB has many bottoms. And I'm afraid we may only have gotten to the first or the second of those bottoms. There are many, many bottoms, and there is much that we still do not know. We do not know, for instance, we do not have, Josh, you may know better than I, but as far as I know, we still do not have the autopsy report. It is still top secret of Stalin's death. We still do not have an account of the sickness, the illness that he suffered at the conclusion of World War II that forced him to recuperate in the South. But we do know that it was relatively severe. We do know that he was more or less incapacitated, and we do know that he put Molotov in charge of the government while he was in the South. And he would communicate with Molotov via telegram on a daily basis and by telephone. On the basis of one of the documents that was found in the KGB collection that we were privileged to work on, however, though not the autopsy report, was the medical account of Stalin's last sickness. That is to say, at the time he became sick and the doctors began attending to him, they kept a record, a careful record, I would say, of his illness. And this has never been published, and I wish I could show it to you. But as we know, the KGB monitors everything we do. And I was explicitly told by them that this document cannot be made public. However, I have it, and if anybody would like to see it, I invite you to come to the YIVO Institute or to my home, and I'll be happy to show it to you. I showed this document to several doctors, the head of cardiology of Yale New Haven Hospital, Larry Davis. I showed it to a pharmacological expert. I showed it to another heart surgeon. I translated it to English, of course. I did not divulge who the patient was. And without question, each of them said, did this man have enemies? Josh said that he died of a stroke, and he might have died of a stroke, but we don't know for sure whether it was a stroke or a heart attack. And of course, the treatment for a stroke and a heart attack are two different things. The first treatment that was given to Stalin when the doctors arrived was that they applied leeches to him. The purpose of leeches is to thin the blood. It's not to suck out the blood, but it's to thin the blood. And this would have been appropriate treatment had he had a stroke. But almost immediately, they shifted to injecting him with caffeine and vitamin K caffeine to speed up the blood, but vitamin K to stop bleeding. And so it was very unclear exactly, the doctors were in the dark. They had no idea how to treat him. They had no idea exactly what he died of. And the medical report goes on for several days. It's extremely detailed. It's very interesting. But unfortunately, there are two medical reports. There is the medical report that they submitted immediately after Stalin died, in which the cause of death is stated to be internal hemorrhaging. Not a stroke, not a heart attack, but internal hemorrhaging. And this suggests that when they discovered him on the floor of the dacha, he was not simply in a pool of his own urine, but probably also blood. Now, blood is of this sort is not normally correlated with having either a heart attack or a stroke. It is rather the result of stomach hemorrhaging. This is what they attributed it to, stomach hemorrhaging. It might have had to do with the stress that he was under. Everyone knew that he had experienced tremendous stress. But it wasn't clear, and the doctors were very specific that he had died of a stomach hemorrhage. In the second report that was issued in July of 1953, that paragraph is cut out. In fact, all references to bleeding was cut out. And it was simply stated that he died of cerebral hemorrhage. So we have two different possibilities. And my co-author, Vladimir Naumov, was convinced that it was bleeding, that he had suffered some kind of hemorrhage, had bled to death. And this would have corresponded, it would have accorded with the idea that he had been poisoned, that it was not simply a natural death. Everybody knew that he was ill. Josh showed those photographs of him. He looked like a dying man. But it doesn't mean that the dying couldn't have been speeded up a bit. And though here too, there is no proof. It's a little bit like the Kirov assassination. Some of you may know what that was. The assassination of Sergei Kirov in 1934 that ignited the Great Terror. Was he assassinated on Stalin's orders? Was it an enraged husband who shot him? We don't know. One of the books that I commissioned in the series was a 1,000-page inquiry into this, using every single document that God ever created to discover whether Stalin was responsible or not, and the jury is still out on this. And I'm afraid the jury will continue to be out on the death of Stalin until we get to the bottom of that KGB archive. However, the things that made Naumov in particular, because I was an American, I was coming at this without having studied Stalin all of my life, and so I was sort of being guided by Naumov's instincts. I would like to explain a little bit of why he was so insistent on the assassination theory. Part of it has to do with an understanding of Stalin's reign of terror, and it was practically a continuous reign of terror from 1929 until his death. It has to do with understanding the structure, the internal structure of the party. It has to do with the way that Stalin also analyzed both the pre-war and the post-war world. For Stalin, the world was always to be divided into black and white. It was always a binary world. And not only Stalin, but also for Lenin, although Lenin had more flexibility internally than Stalin. For Stalin, you were either in one camp or you were in the other. And he gives a speech in 1942, after the war has started, in which he talks about two camps, the imperialist camp and the communist camp. After the war, Zhdanov gives a speech in 1947 in which he elaborates on this idea. There are two irreconcilable forces in the world. There is the capitalist. Forget about fascism, because Stalin thought the fascists were just another species of capitalism, and the communists. And these were set on a collision course. By itself, this could mean only that Stalin was a pessimist. But Stalin was not just a pessimist, he was actually a realist in many, many ways. Some people think of him as an ideologue, but I think if you look at his actual writings and at how he actually conducted himself, you'll see that he was very much a pragmatist. And at the same time, held unquestionably to certain ideological premises. And the fundamental one was that the world was divided into these two realms, and that they would inevitably clash with each other. At the conclusion, or actually, I think it was in 1942, I could be wrong about the date, Beria, whom you saw in those photographs that we've just seen, was put in charge of the atomic bomb project. He was removed from his position as head of the NKVD, MGB, and put in charge of the atomic bomb project. He is the one who supervised that.
Jonathan, we need to move on soon.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Very sorry. I could unfortunately go on far too long. But in 1950, with the advent of the Korean War, these things begin to come to a head. And Stalin sees that the conflict with America is a very real one and a concrete one, and something called the Varfolomeev affair, which is, it was erased from history after Stalin's death, kind of explodes within the security services of the Soviet Union. And the Varfolomeev affair had to do with a spy who was arrested, who claimed that America was planning a nuclear attack on the United States. And Beria was in charge of the atomic bomb project. In the announcement of the doctor's plot in January of 1953, hang on, I'll conclude very shortly. In that document, it is not simply a description of the doctor's plot, but it also makes reference to the Varfolomeev affair. And this is a clear signal that although that affair and that suspicion of atomic espionage and atomic confrontation had been suppressed in the post-war years, for Stalin, it was a real thing. And so Naumov, to just conclude, Naumov's attitude, Naumov's insistence was that Beria was in charge of a plot to assassinate Stalin in order to prevent World War III. I could go into a lot more detail about this, but basically that is the theory behind the assassination.
Well, as you can see, there's a lot to discuss when it comes to this very intriguing and sinister end to a dictator's life. We'll turn the floor to Phil Nord, who's an authority on modern French history at Princeton, and he'll discuss some of the reaction of the French Communist Party to the death of Stalin in March 1953. Phil, please.
Great. Thank you, Josh. And thank you for organizing this event. And thanks to so many classmates for turning out. I shouldn't single anyone out, but I saw that Joe Mandel and Leslie Powell were there. And so I'd like to say a special a hello to them, and also regrets that we can't be face to face for this 50th. The next 50th, I don't think will be around, although I shouldn't be gloomy. Well, as was indicated in the previous talks, there was a good deal of mourning when Stalin died, and this is true for France as well. Not just communists mourn, but cite the case of Claude Lanzmann, whose name some of you will know. He is the filmmaker who made Shoah, a 9-hour masterpiece on the Holocaust. He'd been a communist as a young person, had left the party, but even so, and aware of the doctor's plot, and aware of the show trials of Eastern Europe, he avowed that he still felt a pang of emotion when he learned of Stalin's death. Now, there was some controversy at the time. Slide, please. And it revolved around this particular image. Les Lettres Françaises is the intellectual journal of the French Communist Party. Pablo Picasso was a member at the time. The poet Louis Aragon was a member. The scientist Frédéric Joliot-Curie. And on the occasion of Stalin's death, Picasso did a charcoal sketch of the dead dictator, and many people in the party felt that it was not sufficiently respectful and did not show the leader in the heroic light that he deserved to be shown, and Picasso was reprimanded, although he did not leave the party. So, in some respects, 1953 was not a turning point for the French Communist Party, and indeed, in some ways, it was a high point, as the next slide will indicate. This is a graph slide of the voting results of the French Communist Party, not quite across the life of its existence, but pretty much. It reached a peak in the late 40s and was still very high in the early 1950s. The French electorate voted a quarter to a fifth of its members for the French Communist Party, and it really wouldn't collapse until the 1970s. Although you could see there's some falling off over the course of the 1960s. So the question I just want to pose in the few minutes that remain to me and address is, why didn't Stalin's death make a difference? Or to put it the other way, why were so many people voting for the French Communist Party? And some of this had to do with the party's immediate past. In the 1930s, it had been a small party, but it had thrown itself heart and soul into the Popular Front, the Front Populaire, next slide, which was an alliance of socialists, communists, and a middle-class party called Radicals to defend the French Republic and to mobilize its forces against fascism and enact a program of reform. And the gentleman on the left with the clenched fist is the head of the French Socialist Party, Léon Blum, who would become the first socialist, the first Jew for that matter, to become Prime Minister of France in 1936. And this enterprise received backing from the French Communist Party, who is represented here in the person of the PCF chief, Maurice Thorez, the man with the open hand, standing next to Blum. And this government, the Front Populaire, would support its sister regime in Spain, the Frente Popular. And the communists, when the Frente Popular was attacked by Franco in a coup beginning the Spanish Civil War in 1936, French communists volunteered to fight with the international brigades to fight against fascism in Spain. So in the 1930s, the PCF was in the vanguard of the fight against fascism. There's going to be a parenthesis of 1939 to 1941, which we could talk about, but I will start up my story again in 1941 and with Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June of that year. And with that, the French Communist Party, having stood to the side, throws itself wholeheartedly into France's resistance, into the French resistance against the Vichy regime and the Nazi occupation. It did so with sufficient gusto that many of its militants were killed, and the party began to advertise itself as the Parti des 75 fusillés, the party of the 75,000 executed. It's quite a gross exaggeration, but the truth of the matter still is that the party sacrificed in the resistance. And they had a figure who embodied in a very particular way this kind of anti-fascist resistance, and that was, show the next slide, this man, Colonel Fabian. Next slide, please. There he is. That is his nom de guerre. He's really a party militant named Pierre Georges. And why was the fuss made over him? Because he had fought in the international brigades. When the French Communist Party got involved in the resistance in 1941, he led a party commando that executed a German officer at the Barbès-Rochoir metro station. He took part in the liberation of Paris, an armed uprising in August of 1944. And then he fought alongside Free French forces to rid French territory of the German occupier. And here he is in his Free French uniform. And he was killed on the Alsatian front in 1945. A perfect hero, representing what the party wanted to say it stood for. And they honored this man in a variety of ways. Next slide. There's a metro stop in Paris named after him. There's a square or a place named after him. And it just so happens that when the party refurbished its headquarters in the 1960s, it located those headquarters at the Place du Colonel Fabian, a modernist building designed by Oscar Niemeyer, who was the same architect who designed the city of Brasilia. So the party had a past that it could present as a heroic past, anti-fascist, resistant, let's bracket 39 to 41, and it built on that in the aftermath of the war, placing itself in the vanguard, in the forefront of the world peace movement. In 1948, a peace congress met in Wrocław. I savaged the name, so please forgive me for that. In 1948, the World Congress of Intellectuals in Defense of Peace. Another meeting of the same group took place in Paris in 1949, the World Congress of Partisans of Peace. Next slide, please. And a poster was produced for that occasion, quite celebrated poster. And once again, it's Pablo Picasso who did it with the Dove of Peace, the Picasso Dove of Peace. This is its first appearance, and it would make many, many more. And then in 1950, the World Peace Council issued what was called the Stockholm Appeal. It was a petition which many people signed, and it was in part authored by Frédéric Joliot-Curie, whose name appeared on the masthead of Les Lettres Françaises in my first slide, who was a Nobel winning, getting ahead of ourselves here, a Nobel winning, but we can leave that. Scientists, oh no, we're going too far forward. Back up. If it's
Sorry, one moment, sorry.
If it's at all possible. Yeah, that's fine. So world peace and the, oh dear. So the World Peace Conference was in part sponsored by Joliot-Curie. The communists were deeply involved. So it was not just opposed to nukes, the party, it was also opposed to imperialism. A couple of pieces to this story. It's easy, of course, at this particular juncture for the party to denounce US imperialism. The two preceding speakers, John and Josh, both mentioned the Korean War. Now the next slide. And Picasso did a painting called Massacre in Korea in 1951, a rather large scale. You can't tell it from this particular slide. With on the right, either the forces of the Republic of Korea or American forces shooting down civilians, women naked, round, and on the right, armor and sharp angles. In 1952, General Matthew Ridgway came to Paris. He was a senior US officer, actually accused of engaging in bacteriological warfare in Korea. It's a false accusation, but just the same. When he came to Paris, there was a massive demonstration that ended in a riot in 1952, and the arrest of Jacques Duclos, who was a senior communist official, and the event and communist participation and the repression of the event prompted Jean-Paul Sartre to declare an anti-communist is a rat. Well, as I said, it's easy to denounce someone else's imperialism, but they also denounce French imperialism at the same time. For in 1951 and in 1950 and 1940, there is a war going on in Indochina. In the aftermath of the war, France tried to reclaim its possession in Indochina, which had been occupied at the very end of the war by the Japanese, and this was resisted, giving rise to a colonial war. And the party declared its opposition to the First Indochina War. Now the next slide, and I show you in that connection this painting of Marseille dockers in 1949, refusing to load armaments destined for troops in Indochina. The artist is Boris Tazlitsky, who was a longtime party poet. Also, I should add, a concentration camp survivor. So the party was very much opposed, and this wanted support in some quarters in the Hexagon in metropolitan France, but also in France's colonies. And I'll show you my final slide, which is of Aimé Césaire. I think it's a name some of you may know, Martinican poet. And politician, member of the Communist Party for many years, mayor of Fort-de-France, deputy to the National Assembly. He quit the party in 1956. That's another story. But when Stalin died, he went to Moscow to be part of the funeral. And that kind of brings us full circle, but I want to bring us full circle in just one other way. He was a mentor to Frantz Fanon. And some of you will remember, also a Martinican, that Fanon published Les Damnés de la Terre, The Wretched of the Earth, in 1961. And I have a memory, and I would love it if someone could confirm this, that our freshman week, there was a panel on The Wretched of the Earth and Frantz Fanon, and that was the first time I heard Fanon's name, but not the last time. Thank you.
Phil, thank you very much. That helps round up the picture a bit. Now we'll ask Paul Berman to speak. Paul is well known for his writing on politics and culture, lives in New York, and is a member of our class again, and we're glad to hear from Paul. Thank you. You're muted.
Paul, I just requested to unmute you.
Paul needs to be unmuted.
Yep, Paul, I've asked to unmute you. If you can just accept my invitation. Let's see here. If you click on the three dots in the upper right-hand corner of your tile. Unfortunately, I can't unmute you myself.
Let's give it a minute, work it out.
What I'm going to do, Paul, is I'm going to make you a co-host, and then hopefully that will help. Let's see here. Paul, you should be a co-host of the event now. Let's see if that helps with the unmuting. No worries. Perhaps if you give me just 1 second, let me see here.
Now, Paul, I don't know what your screen looks like, but on the bottom left of mine, when I move the cursor down there, there's a little microphone and it says mute. And if you have a red line through it, you're muted. But if you click on it, the red line will disappear and then you will be unmuted.
There you are.
Okay. Philip, thank you very much. So sorry for the little delay. I will offer an alternative explanation to the mysterious question of how it is that Stalin could have had so much allure and why it was that when he died, so many people were sincerely upset and they remained upset, such that the cult of Stalin persisted. I would say it still persists. I draw my alternative explanation from the books by Jonathan and Josh, and especially from the book by Josh, but really both of them, but Josh's book especially, because I read Josh's book in an alternative light, which is literary. If you read Josh's book, The Last Days of Stalin, as a literary book, you ought to be able to recognize it immediately as a brother or cousin of the dictator novels of Latin America. And so it resembles very much one novel after another, especially there are a whole series of dictator novels, but they specialize in novels about the death of the dictator. The greatest of those novels, or the most apropos, is Mario Vargas Llosa's novel, The Feast of the Goat, from 2000, which is about the assassination of Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Trujillo was the dictator from 1930 to 1961 when he was assassinated by a conspiracy of the people around him. What you see in Vargas Llosa's novel is precisely what you see in Josh's work of history, which is an incredible, intense environment around the dictator, in which everyone loves the dictator. Everyone speaks nothing but glorious words about the dictator. The love of the dictator. Well, I'm describing now Vargas Llosa's portrait. The love of the dictator has a kind of masochistic quality, that one revels in one's own humiliation. One grovels before the dictator. At the same time, the love of the dictator contains a perfect willingness to turn around and stab him in the back as soon as possible. The love of the dictator contains the assumption that oneself might get murdered at any moment by a whim of the dictator. So everyone around the dictator lives in intense terror, in a dramatic atmosphere of day to day, not knowing whether you're going to be shot or you're going to be promoted, and whether you're going to lovingly offer your daughter to the dictator, or given the chance, whether you will participate in a plot to assassinate the dictator. And what Vargas Llosa's novels in particular shows is that this kind of dictatorship has a charisma. People like this. People respond well to this. And it has a charisma because there is, in this kind of life, in this kind of cult of the dictator and the dictator himself, a sort of wisdom about what the world is like. So that the cult of the dictator expresses the idea that life is cruel. The Boy Scout vision of life is a complete lie. What life is about is self-advancement, self-protection, fidelity to those who are loyal to you, and betrayal of them as soon as you can, because that's what life is like. So people like this kind of dictator. People respond well to him because they see in him an expression of what seems to them a truth. And it's a rebellious truth. It's a truth at odds with all the other political doctrines, the non-dictatorial doctrines. So it's not a nice liberalism. It's not a nice conservatism. It's not a nice Catholicism. It's against nice. It's in favor of a recognition of the ugliness of life. I think this is the real appeal of Stalin. I think that at some level, everyone knew the truths that emerged from Josh's book and from Jonathan's book too. On one level, yes, they might have been deceived. They might have thought that Stalin was advancing world peace and was opposing imperialism and was favoring the working class and was doing all the wonderful things that people say motivated them. But they had another level too, in which all those nice things, the drippy nice things, were accompanied by this other vision of life, in which life is ugly and it's hard. And the communists are the ones who recognize the ugliness and the hardness. And the communist leaders are the ones who recognize it most clearly of all. And they recognize it in the way they live, which is to plot and conspire against one another and assassinate one another if they can, and live a life that's not really different from the life of the leaders of the criminal mafia. There is an appeal in that. That I believe is the actual combination of traits that account for it. And as I say, it's a lasting appeal. I'll conclude by recalling to you, my classmates, that at Columbia in our day, there was a lot of discussion of Stalin among the students. I was a member of SDS, which was a social democratic organization, an anti-communist social democratic organization. That's the organization I thought I joined, and which said it was that kind of organization. And yet among the students, we were passing back and forth Stalin's pamphlet, Marxism and the National Question. And the challenge to SDS, everyone will remember, came from the Progressive Labor Party, which was a Maoist party, which was a splinter of the American Communist Party. And the Progressive Labor Party was overtly championing Stalin. Stalin was the great leader of the left. So there was a lot of discussion of Stalin. Was he good or bad? And a lot of people, you may not remember this, but I assure you, a lot of people argued he was good. And now all of this seemed to go away for many years. But right now, actually, we're seeing in certain circles of the student left or the young people's left in America, not just in America, a resurgence of these beliefs. So there it is. It is a powerful allure. It is complex allure. It is an allure that's more than political. In some ways, it is an anti-political allure, but it is certainly an allure.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Jonathan and Phil and Paul for joining us. We have certainly a few minutes, if not more, for questions and comments. So unmute everybody, speak up. You don't have to raise your hand. Speak up. No need for me to call on you. Let's unmute everybody if we could and hear from other people. By the way, let me add 2 movies on this subject. There's the satirical movie, The Death of Stalin, that came out a few years ago. That's based on a French graphic satirical novel. And now there's a new documentary out by a Ukrainian filmmaker called State Funeral, where he's found a great deal of documentary material from the days of the actual funeral in the streets of Moscow. It's just come out. I have not had a chance to see it yet. So there's still a lot of interest in this very subject out there. So I'm pleased you've joined us and speak up, everybody, whoever's interested. Thank you.
So Josh, that satirical movie was not based on your book?
No, my book is the real story.
But it had all these guys, trying to figure out what had happened after they found Stalin half dead, and that's some American actors playing these Russians, which really, I'm speaking to you from Latvia, and my wife studied in Moscow, and she was terribly amused by these characters playing Russians. So,
Yes, well, the one thing about the movie is really grounded in what really happened in a funny kind of way. But the one thing I assure you is that Khrushchev, Malenkov, and Molotov were serious guys. They were not clowns.
okay.
They're portrayed as clowns. And it's very funny, but it's a departure from reality, as you might expect. Thank you, Eurus. Other
Oh,
questions?
I want to address Paul's that mafia idea seems to be, and the sort of submissiveness to the powerful leader seems to be another explanation of what Stalin was all about. It was a mafia, where anybody could cut anybody's throat at the drop of a hat under the right circumstances.
You're saying it was not a mafia.
It was.
It was a mafia.
It was a mafia, and the mafia has a glamour, and it has a glamour precisely because everyone cuts everyone else's throat, because that's seen to speak a wisdom. I don't think that Donald Trump resembles Stalin, but the appeal of Trump has something to do with this too. That if Trump is shown to be a gangster, if Trump is actually charged with crimes as seems now possible, and let's say he's brought to court, and let's say he's convicted and sent to jail, it won't happen. But if it happened, masses of people would be more entranced by him, would find him more appealing, because there's an appeal in having a gangster leader, and a gangster leader is someone who has a vision of life. So Stalin was, in that respect, one of the great leaders.
Kind of like Putin today in some ways, the gangster leader, who rose up from the KGB, and to your point, Paul, obviously one of Trump's greatest heroes, Putin. But I want to ask the question about, do we know how many people Stalin actually murdered? And do we know how many Jews he actually sent to Siberia, and how many other people he sent to Siberia?
Well, others may wish to speak up, but it's the general number for the total number of victims is about 18 million, based on the research of the Memorial Society in Moscow, who've looked at many of the archives. The principal campaigns against the Jews specifically take place after the war on the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, on Yiddish leaders, Yiddish cultural leaders. And the figures there are in the hundreds. But obviously, during the purges, many Jews were caught up because they were active in the Communist Party, because they had leadership roles in industry or culture. And we don't think that they were targeted because they were Jewish, but because of their other roles in Soviet society. The anti-Semitic nature of the regime really took hold more vividly during the war, ironically, and then after the war, because of Cold War tensions and the establishment of Israel, and the fact that Soviet Jews showed a great deal of interest and passionate interest in what was happening in the Middle East, and that aroused Stalin's anger.
Could I just add one?
Of course.
Thing, which is that the total number of victims is by no means completely understood. There are numerous mass graves that have not been discovered, even in Ukraine and elsewhere. There are the children who were thrown out of boxcars and disappeared. Oleg Khlevnyuk, the great Russian historian, puts the number of those who went through the Gulag, not the number of those who died, but who went through the Gulag at 50 million. And some of those people went through more than once.
Yeah.
So it is not by any means We know that there were at least 2 million kulaks who were deported. We know that in 1937 alone, something like 700,000 people were arrested and about 350,000 shot. But Memorial is a good source, but the documentation is still just very, very difficult to provide.
Speaking sort of from the history of Latvia, the entire red Latvian, quote unquote, red Latvian exile in Moscow, in Russia, the Red Latvian Rifles, Latvian theater, cultural organizations, they were all wiped out in 1937. In fact, there's a poster that was done at the very end as the Soviet Union was collapsing by a Latvian artist that had a kind of a silhouette of the back of someone's head and just the letters 1937 and one red spot for where a person would have been shot in the back of the head. Very dramatic summary of what happened to these exiles.
The same was true for hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens who were in Leningrad and other major cities, were all rounded up in the late 30s and killed. Hundreds of thousands.
Basically, all of the non-Russian groups, non-ethnic Russians who had gone into the Soviet Union, ended up meeting their fate.
A message is he's an engineer, so he can.
Other questions, please. Comments or questions?
So I have a question for the panel. In today's politics, there's an associated.
Tosh, we're not hearing you well.
Quick
We're not hearing you
interruption.
well.
If you aren't, just a quick interruption. If you aren't speaking, would you just please put your microphone on mute, as it creates a little background noise that makes it hard to hear. There we go. Much better. Thank you.
May I speak? May I speak? Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for the presentations, classmates. As experts commentating on Stalin's communism and Phil commenting on communism in France, when you look at today's politics and think about the left wing and Bernie Sanders, the typical right wing approach is to associate Bernie's democratic socialism with Stalin's communism in the most pejorative sense. But going back to communism and Stalin, where did things go wrong from the notion of equity and solidarity and the rights of the worker versus the proletariat? When one thinks historically, one thinks of all the horrors of the communist movement. In France, Phil would probably, speak to the ongoing belief of many French communists as upholding the virtue of the principles of communism, Marxism, and so forth. But in today's presentation, we're looking at the horrors, and we're going to come away thinking about the 8 million innocents who perished under an authoritarian regime. The fact of the kind of integration of communism with the notion of totalitarianism is very problematic, but I would ask the historically enlightened, how did that all happen, and what can you say about that? Especially in light of today's politics, where I think from the notion of virtue, one would want to uphold the concept of equity and the rights of every human being. You can think about Noam Chomsky as well, he didn't go to Columbia, he went to Penn, but he might be the stellar Columbia graduate in taking the history of modern thought and integrating with science and coming through with this integrative concept that ultimately what it all means is that we have to embrace one another in a brotherhood of man and solidarity. When you think about the principles of communism, it came from there, but became corrupted. I'd like the panelists to speak to the notion of that corruption.
I think it's a great question, and it's one I have to deal with in the courses that I teach on Stalin. But you cannot understand where Stalin came from. You cannot even understand Lenin's cruelty unless you understand the horror of the Russian Civil War and the aftermath of World War I, which left Russia in complete ruin. And even though in The State and Revolution, Lenin writes that the function of government should be about that of the post office, that is delivering the mail. And one of the first things that he did was sign a decree abolishing the police. He quickly reversed himself when he saw that he existed in a world of total chaos, in which whites were fighting reds, in which Mensheviks were fighting Bolsheviks, in which ultra-nationalist Ukrainians were fighting Russians, in which Ukrainians are killing Jews, in which Poles are killing Ukrainians. And literally the country was going up in flames. And what held the country together, at least the Bolshevik part of the country together, was the party and the concept of the party. And so you cannot really understand Stalin, and we can speak of him as a mafia boss, but we can't understand where that came from unless we understand the way the party took shape as a result of the Civil War, and especially what happened in 1920, in 1919 or 21, with Kronstadt, the Kronstadt Rebellion, in which it was no longer just the whites attacking the reds, the Mensheviks attacking the Bolsheviks, or the SRs, or all of the other groups. It was Soviet soldiers rebelling against Soviet order. And at that point, Lenin wrote a declaration that forbade dissent within the party. He wrote a declaration in which he advocated total iron discipline within the party. And it was exactly the same time that he responded to this chaos by instituting the NEP, the new economic policy, in an attempt to quell some of the disorder. So this is an extremely difficult subject, but Stalin didn't take power like Al Capone with a baseball bat or with a gun. He took power because people needed him to take power. And at a certain point, at a Politburo meeting in 1933, the communist gets up after Stalin is being criticized. He says, "Comrade, Stalin is ours. Stalin is us. He is the party. And if you want the party to remain strong, you have to support Stalin." So this, I mean, other people can add more to it, but this is the hit. You've got to understand this progression. Stalin himself did not begin as a tyrant. He was a brutal man, yes, but there are many brutal men, like my father, for instance, who don't become tyrants and don't become gangsters. They're just brutal men, that's all. But what is it that turned that weaponized that brutality? And anyway.
I'll give a slightly alternative explanation. The question was, when did the problem begin? The problem began, in my interpretation, before the Civil War. It began in October 1917.
Okay.
And And because Bolshevism fundamentally was an attack on, first of all, the left. Bolshevism did not rise up against Tsarism, it rose up against the left, because the left had come to power, was coming to power. The Bolshevik Revolution itself was aimed against a government of the left. And when the Bolsheviks, within a few months, dissolved the Constituent Assembly, it was because the Constituent Assembly was going to return a government of the left, which was going to mean the Mensheviks or the Social Democrats and the Socialist Revolutionaries and their allies, who were liberals, and so the whole thing from the start was an attack on the left, and all the principles of the left, of solidarity, of egalitarianism, opposition to stupid prejudices and bigotries, opposition to pogroms, a favoring of liberty, a bias toward the working class. All those principles came under instant attack from the Bolsheviks. And this was true in Russia, and it was true in New York. In New York, we had our own history of this. The Russian Revolution was fought out in the streets of New York at the end of the 1910s and in the 1920s and 30s. And then again, it was the communists in their attack on the New York trade unions and their attack on the Social Democrats of New York. That's the explanation. And it was always true, and I think it's a delusion to think otherwise.
Any other questions or comments for us?
Well, I have something to say. Just to add to Paul's analysis of Stalin's power, I think those who are interested in this question, those who are interested in Stalin's power, his ability to command this internal allegiance, and not just the show of allegiance, but the sort of visceral allegiance of masses around the world. You should read Life and Fate of Vasily Grossman and other works by Grossman, which is a long disquisition on precisely this subject. There's a scene in that novel in which Stalin calls one of the professors on the telephone, and the professor's wife hears his voice and she just stands up. She just stands up. And then later in the novel, she says to herself, I wonder why I stood up. Why did I stand up? And that is the whole question of the novel. Why do you stand up to this power, thuggery, whatever it is, this internal command?
You know, I'd like to say something too, and sparking off what Jonathan just said. Vasily Grossman, I shouldn't speak as though he's someone I know well, but I don't see him as mesmerized by gangsterism. And so I think charismatic leadership, yes, that certainly makes sense to me. But there is some appeal that is being made, either to Russianness or to anti-fascism. In the case of someone like Vasily Grossman, he'll suffer for it. That's no doubt about that. But that there's something there, and if you wanted to transpose it into a democratic setting, and that's partly in response to responding what Tosh brought in. Hi, it's good to see you, Tosh. That they don't have responsibility, the French Communist Party, but the party does command enormous loyalty, and not just because of the Stalin, but because the party represents something to people, and to be excluded from it and from that social world is punishing to people who are shunned and thrown out. So there is an emotive connection of some kind, but I don't think it's necessarily personal. Certainly not Maurice Torres, who's about as unexciting a person as you could possibly find. And then last of all, just to the Trump issue, and if we think of him only as a gangster, we're only halfway there in terms of why he has an enduring appeal to certain strata of our nation. And it's and if it were just people love gangsters, why aren't we all ruled by gangsters? So,
Any other questions, comments?
I just have a comment from my own personal experience 25 years ago.
Please,
I w-
Terry.
Yes, I was living in Kazakhstan and desperately trying to do what you, Joshua, and Jonathan did in college, was learning some Russian while working, and I would hitchhike and any car that stopped, I'd take the advantage of talking with the driver to beef up on my Russian, and I'd ask the old men, what did they think of the government, which at the time had a president for life, and they admired him very much, and they would say he resembled Stalin, and I would ask, what was it that about Stalin that they found so attractive? And the reply was always that he was strong, that he was powerful. There was some visceral, non well thought through something, I think, in the Russian look on life, certainly among that generation, that someone who was strong was the person that you would want to emulate and you would look up to, and I think that's somewhat consistent with what Jonathan has said. Over.
Thank you. Other questions or comments?
A quick comment. It reminds me very much of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, this conversation today. Very interesting. Thank you. I don't know if you guys know much about Hugo Chavez, but he's gone now. A little like Stalin.
Yeah, Mussolini of the tropics, right.
I actually have a personal Stalin memory. One of my earliest, I must have been about 4 years old, and we were living in Boston, and the Boston Globe had come in. My grandmother, who did not speak English at the time, was poking out the eyes of a portrait of Stalin in the newspaper, because she was, so both enraged and glad that it was sort of like the free borscht thing almost, that Stalin, was dead, because the reason we were there, the reason we were refugees in the US, of course, was because of Stalin and a number of other things that happened. If you sort of read Timothy Snyder's book, we sort of lived on the periphery of the Bloodlands, which were the centerpiece was apparently, by Snyder's interpretation, was Belarus.
Thank you, Eurus. You're living closer than all of us to the belly of the whale, so.
Yep. Been working on the whole Ryanair Belarus story now for 3 days for various news media over here.
Good for you. Thank you. Well, everyone, thanks. Good to see all of you. I think there's some more events coming for our reunion, but I'm grateful to Eric Shea and Annie and Tandy for helping us out this evening. And I want to thank Jonathan and Phil and Paul for joining us for very good conversation, and has its controversy as it should have. And it resonates with all of us because of our experience at Columbia in those days. Certainly the strike 50 years ago, 49 years ago, whatever it was, 47 years ago, raised many of these issues about power and propaganda and the allure, and we all remember it so vividly. Anyway, thank you. And Annie, thank you for helping us out this evening. Good night, everybody. Thank you all.
Can I just say
Excellent
one
program.
last thing? I thought this was an absolutely incredible event. And so, again, thank you to all that organized this and all of those who participated. So thank you very much.
Outstanding,
Peter.
outstanding. Thank you, thank you.
Good night from 2:30 in the morning in Latvia.
Yes.
Excellent sleep.
Thanks,
You
Eurus.
guys
You get
do
the
it.
prize. You get the prize, Eurus.
All right, see you guys at another event. See you in New York next
Night.
time.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Our 75th.
We're not going to wait that long.
All right, good.